evening. Well, first tonight, some big breaking news. I can exclusively reveal that former Home Affairs Secretary Mike Pezzullo is set to be stripped of his Order of Australia. The distinguished public servant was sacked by Anthony Albanese for sending text messages to a friend of Liberal Prime Ministers Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison. There was no corruption or criminality involved. Yet I've learnt that there are now procedural steps in hand to strip Pezzullo of his AO. Pezzullo has been made aware of this move. As of 2023, only 46 people have had their honours stripped since the awards began back in 1960. And it's been reported that almost all of those were because of criminal or civil convictions. An award can be removed if, in the opinion of the Governor-General, a person has behaved or acted in a way that has brought disrepute on the order. Well, Mike Pezzullo was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in the 2020 Queen's Birthday Honours for distinguished services to public administration through his leadership roles in the areas of national security, border control and immigration. The award was given for his lifetime of work. Well, I asked former Prime Minister Tony Abbott today about Mike Pezzullo, and he told me, "I regard Pezzullo as an outstanding public servant who worked for governments of both persuasions with energy and commitment. Of all the senior border protection officials from September 2013, he was the one above all who was convinced that the boats both could and should be stopped. In my view, his departure from public service is a serious loss to our country." I also spoke today with former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, and he told me that Secretary Pezzullo was one of the most effective, capable and committed public servants he's ever had the good fortune to work with. Scott Morrison said from stopping the boats to establishing the Australian Border Force and his role advising Cabinet through the National Security Committee, Mike was highly respected for his intellect, insights and practical ability to just get things done. Above all, Mike was a great Australian patriot who always put the national interest first above all else. Now, here's the key point. Scott Morrison said to me, "No one was more deserving of recognition in our honours system as a public servant than Mike. He is a big loss to the Australian public service." Scott Morrison also said he was an important internal voice to governments of both political persuasions on protecting Australia's national security. Now, Mike Pezzullo joined the public service some 37 years ago. He's worked at a senior level with both sides of politics. He worked for Labor Foreign Minister Gareth Evans in the 90s and then Labor leader Kim Beazley more than 2 decades ago. And that was when they first discussed setting up a Home Affairs super ministry. Pezzullo then went on to serve in senior roles in defence, immigration and Australian customs and border protection. But as Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison mentioned, he played an integral role in stopping the boats and in Operation Sovereign Borders. While he was highly effective, his hardline stance on immigration saw him become a controversial figure and an enemy of the left. There were also senior figures in the coalition who fought against the creation of the Home Affairs Department, including George Brandis and Julie Bishop. Malcolm Turnbull went ahead and created the super ministry anyway. There are some now in Labor who have worked to weaken Home Affairs and its powers. There was undoubtedly both a media and a political campaign to oust Pezzullo and to discredit Home Affairs. There were political games, with Home Affairs Minister Clare O'Neil accused publicly of white-handing Pezzullo long before he was eventually terminated.
Clare O'Neil's at war with her secretary at the moment. You see the review that she's just commissioned to try and white-hand Mike Pezzullo, the secretary of her Home Affairs Department.
I don't think there's any question that it's political. I mean, an important point here is that there's obviously a huge battle going on at the moment between the Home Affairs Minister Clare O'Neil and the Secretary of her department, Mike Pezzullo, who was a secretary when I was at the department. He's a first-class public servant, and I was very well served by him and by the public servants within the Department of Home Affairs.
Well, Anthony Albanese sacked Pezzullo in late November after a review found that his text messages with Liberal power broker Scott Briggs breached the Public Service Code through using his position to gain a benefit for himself, also failing to be apolitical and engaging in disrespectful critiques of ministers and other public servants. Well, the personal benefit wasn't money or salary or advantage. Pezzullo was already a highly paid department secretary. The personal benefit was supposedly having a personal communication channel with senior leadership that wasn't available to other secretaries. Well, this conclusion couldn't accurately be reached without checking the phones and messages of the other departmental secretaries, some of whom are long-term friends with ministers, lobbyists and power brokers. It's also the case that Pezzullo already had direct access to both the Prime Ministers he worked under, Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison. He didn't require the back channel through Scott Briggs. Now, Peter Dutton and Michael McCormack, among others, publicly defended Pezzullo at the time.
I can tell you from my time as Minister, Mr Pezzullo served the government faithfully, as he did the Labor Party when they were in power, and he was able to, I think in all of his interactions, put the country first, and that's what I think you've seen demonstrated in his work at Home Affairs. He had a passion for Home Affairs because he believes very strongly in national security and border protection. He had a background in defence and he served this country, both Liberal and Labor governments, for many decades.
So we're just breaking the news now that there are plans to strip Mike Pezzullo of his AO despite no corruption or criminality. This is a very rare move. Mike Pezzullo has given a lifetime of service to Australia, including stopping the boats, strengthening the borders. But now, because of his gossipy text messages with a lobbyist, he's facing having his order stripped. The tribunal that will consider removing the AO is meant to operate independently from government, although there is a representative of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet who sits on it. Ultimately, it will be the Governor-General, David Hurley, who will need to make a final call on this recommendation from the tribunal. He would need to agree with such an extreme measure. One source I spoke to today said that removing Mike Pezzullo's AO would only bring the honour system itself into disrepute because it shows that it would be open to bureaucratic interference. Now, also coming up on the show tonight, a prominent Israeli Arab journalist who specialises in Palestinian affairs will join me here live in studio, and he's arguing that Hamas needs to be defeated. I'm also going to have high-profile lawyer Jennifer Robinson on air, and she claims that there's a CIA plot to kill her client, Julian Assange. That fascinating story is coming up a little later. But joining me now, let's bring in Shadow Education Minister Sarah Henderson and Perth Mayor Basil Zemplis. Welcome, Sarah and Basil. Look, let's get your reaction to this move. You would have just heard it here for the very first time. We just revealed that Mike Pezzullo has been told he's going to be stripped of his AO. Sarah Henderson, what do you think about this?
Well, Sharri, good evening, and I have to say I'm quite shocked by what appears to be a partisan political attack on a highly credentialed public servant, someone who has served both sides of politics very well and, of course, as Peter Dutton has made clear, did a very good job when the borders were in chaos under the former government in stopping the boats. One has to wonder whether this is all part of the immigration mess that we are seeing under this government. We know this government is in chaos. Perhaps this is part of just a nasty campaign. It certainly looks that way, Sharri.
Well, Basil, we know that it's a very rare move to actually remove someone's AO. As I said, since the award's inception back in 1960, there's only been around 46 people, there were 46 as of May 2023, who've had their awards removed, the majority over criminal convictions. I mean, this is nothing. I mean, Mike Pezzullo a distinguished public servant? What do you think?
Certainly unprecedented and a significant breaking story, and well done, Sharri, on that. So I'm going on the information that you have just presented to the audience, and we've heard from you that in order to be stripped of one of these very high honours, the recipient has to have been proved or established to have brought the order into disrepute. So the question ultimately will be, has Pezzullo done that? Now, we know that the accusation was he failed to protect confidential government information. I think thousands of text messages were considered or looked at, but the breach of code of conduct was only recorded as 14 times from, I think, thousands and thousands of messages. Therefore, and we did hear, no corruption and no criminality. So on that basis alone, with the facts that you have presented tonight, has he brought the order into disrepute? I would think not. And on that basis, I would think it would be a pretty extraordinary act if he were to lose that very high honour. We know people that have won Order of Australia medals of all categories have made indiscretions in later life and haven't been stripped of their medals. Does this qualify? On the evidence you've presented, I don't think it does. Yeah.
So for people just tuning in now, we've just revealed that Mike Pezzullo has been informed in writing that he is going to be stripped of his AO that he was awarded in 2020. He does have an opportunity to respond if he chooses. Ultimately, it comes down to the Governor-General, David Hurley, to actually take that action. But this is the recommendation. Now, let's have a look at some of the other top stories today. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has been criticised for his Trump-style travel ban by none other than the Russian embassy. Now, this story hasn't had a lot of play, but under the proposed changes, the Immigration Minister could actually prevent foreigners and tourists from entering Australia if their home country refuses to accept the return of failed asylum seekers. So the country is expected to be blacklisted. It includes Russia, Iran, Iraq, South Sudan and Zimbabwe. A Russian embassy spokesperson told the Daily Mail today that they're struggling to remember a single occasion where the Australian government expressed concerns about the removal of a Russian national not having a valid reason to remain or asked us for cooperation with such removal. Sarah Henderson, I mean, this is quite unusual. They are quite extreme laws. What do you think?
Well, Sharri, we've been very concerned for many months about the government's gross mismanagement of immigration and our borders. We've seen month after month of botched legislation, of panic responses, and this is another one of those responses. And that's why we want to test this proposed legislation in a proper Senate inquiry. We're not going to cop, and neither should Australians, the way that this government is managing immigration. And I am pleased that there will be a comprehensive Senate inquiry into this bill.
Breaking news this evening that China has scrapped tariffs on Australian wine, putting to an end a 3-year campaign of trade pressure. Basil, look, we were expecting this. There's been hints from the Prime Minister. I mean, he visited a winery. Do you think we're getting the right balance when it comes to relations with China?
Well, certainly for those people that are in the wine industry, we know this is going to be very welcome. We've already seen them celebrate the impending announcement that these tariffs were about to be dropped. So it's important, it's significant for a cross-section of the business community. They will welcome this. Whether it is the absolute laser focus area that the federal government should be concentrating on, I think is debatable. They might argue, well, it's a good start, and if we can improve relations in one area, it might lead to improved relations in other. We know that tonight, as we get ready for Easter, many of our winemakers and grape growers will be celebrating. This will be significant for their business. So on that score alone, it's a positive. You can't argue with that.
Yeah, no question it's a positive, Sarah, but there is also criticism of the Australian government, including from us here on this program, that they have been too silent on Chinese aggression, political interference, its actions in the South China Sea, that, you know, in order to get the relationship back on track, we're effectively silent on anything else that China does.
Well, Sharri, as you know, we have raised a range of concerns in relation to the way the government is managing the relationship with China. I have to say the news today is good news. We have a very important trading relationship with China, but it does reiterate and, of course, suggest very strongly that the coalition's position that we weren't going to be coerced by these economic sanctions, that has played out as being the right decision. And I am pleased to see this decision by China, which is very good for our wine growers, but more importantly, very good for our entire economy in that it builds confidence in our trading relationship.
Now, earlier this week, I revealed on the show how visiting Tel Aviv University officials, including the Tel Aviv University Vice President, was actually locked in a room with pro-Palestinian activists at the University of Sydney. I showed the footage of the security guards standing right outside the room. Liberal Senator Dave Sharma has now sent a letter to the University of Sydney's Vice-Chancellor Mark Scott. As you know, he's the former Managing Director at the ABC. Here's what Dave Sharma said. He says it's highly regrettable and disappointing that international guests were made to feel unwelcome and personally threatened, and that other international guests witnessed such treatment. He's demanded of Mark Scott an explanation. Sarah Henderson, I understand, you're Shadow Education Minister. You're also planning to write a letter to demand answers here.
Sharri, absolutely. I've written to Mark Scott on a number of occasions, raising serious concerns about the safety of Jewish students and also academics. But this is a shocking, shocking incident. I do not understand why the University of Sydney did not intervene. The fact that these academics appeared, based on your report, to have been locked in this room, and there was also some suggestion that they were being blockaded by academic staff from the University of Sydney, is also appalling. So this university needs to leave no stone unturned in investigating what happened. There are important policies against vilification, bullying, harassment. But I also ask, have any criminal acts been committed here? Was the police called in? And why, if they weren't, why not? I mean, this is just extreme, and I cannot understand how the university is tolerating this sort of behaviour. Mark Scott has some very, very big questions to answer on this.
Yeah, it's shocking judgment. I mean, imagine having visiting senior university representatives. They're being bombarded by the pro-Palestinian activists, these radical extremists, and thinking it's a good idea to lock them in the same room with guards standing outside. It's just shocking.
Look, it's absolutely appalling, really and we do need full answers. It's just shocking. Yeah. And frankly, Sydney University is one of the worst. It's got to do a much better job at managing the sort of safety attacks we are seeing against Jewish students and academics.
The universities are the cold face.
And you have to add, Sharri, yeah, and you have to add, congratulations, that's two big stories you've broken this week. You have to add that universities should understand this space much better than other sections of our community, you would think. You would think they would have empathy for their guests, for relations between people of different countries, specifically, obviously, with the issues that exist in the world around us at the moment. So to have had no oversight, to have taken none of that into consideration, and then to have acted in what appears to be a very heavy-handed and almost draconian lacking in any compassion fashion, it beggars belief. There should be a full inquiry, and the university shouldn't be asked or told to do the inquiry. They should be putting their hand up and volunteering straight away to conduct their own thorough inquiry so that we can all get some answers, because that sort of thing just should never happen. It's a bad look for Australia, full stop.
And you know what else? You know what else,
and Sharri,
Basil?
can I just add also, sorry to cut in.
No, go for it.
So can I just cut in? It also appears, and I'm not going to name this person, but I believe there was one prominent pro-Palestinian activist, an academic from Sydney University, who is leading the charge on this. It is about time that this university decided to sack some of these staff, because there's
Sarah,
one staff member in particular.
I've already named him. I showed his tweets on the program. That's the University of Sydney academic Nick Reamer, because he tweeted encouraging protesters to target the Tel Aviv University staff days before they were due to visit. So we've named him because he
it's time
is on
he
the
went,
record.
honestly.
He's
He is
on Twitter as encouraging this protest.
He is bringing this university into disrepute, and it is time Mark Scott acted and got rid of him.
Yeah. All right, Basil Zemplis.
And it brings all Australian universities into disrepute internationally. When this news travels, when more people hear about it, we want our universities to be safe havens for learning and discussion and thought-provoking ideas. But we also want to see some common sense from our learning centres. And don't forget, it's where we want a lot of our kids to go after they finish high school. And we want to know that when they get there, they're going to be looked after, they're going to be safe, and they're not going to be thrown into situations that can become very dangerous and uncomfortable.
I mean, and I think the safety is the key point. And gosh, if you were a Jewish Australian, would you be going to the University of Sydney and putting up with this environment? I don't think so. Basil Zemplis, Sarah Henderson, we're out of time. I really appreciate you both joining me. Thank you very much. Now, coming up, why a growing number of Palestinians have become to criticise Hamas. An Israeli Arab journalist will join me. Plus, Julian Assange's high-profile lawyer will be on air. I've done an interview with her, and she claims there's a CIA plot to kill her client Assange. It's fascinating. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, after the United States demanded of Israel a ceasefire and abstained from the UN vote, Benjamin Netanyahu cancelled his trip to Washington. But White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said on Wednesday that the Israeli Prime Minister had agreed to reschedule the meeting dedicated to Rafah. And meanwhile, the offensive in Rafah appears to be stalling. Let's bring in now a special guest, award-winning Israeli Arab journalist, lecturer and documentary filmmaker, Khaled Abu Toemeh. Welcome to this program and to Australia. Great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, you know, a lot of people don't realise that actually 20% of the population in Israel are Israeli Arabs. They're not Jews. What's the Israeli Arab community's general reaction and consensus to Israel's war on Hamas?
Well, it's not, I mean, the question is not how we respond to Israel's war on Hamas, it's how do we respond to the Hamas attack on Israel? And the vast majority of us, the Arabs inside Israel, are opposed to it. We've condemned it. We haven't engaged in any violence against Israel. We have spoken out against it on numerous occasions. Now, why are we opposed to it? Because no one can identify with such atrocities that happened on October 7th. It goes against our values, it goes against our religion. The vast majority of us, the Arabs inside Israel, are Muslim. This is not what Islam taught us. So for that reason, number one, we could not identify with such atrocities. And number two, many Arabs fell victim to that attack. 21 Arab Muslims were killed by Hamas on that day. 5 or 6 other Muslims were kidnapped by Hamas into Gaza, and some of them are still in Gaza. So
being held hostage.
Yes, being held hostage. And for that reason, we, the Arabs in Israel, have come out against it, we have condemned it, and we cannot accept something like this.
And so you've condemned the attacks by Hamas. Does that then mean that you agree with Israel's war on Hamas in Gaza?
We understand why Israel went to war. I mean, Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel has a right to respond to that attack, and Israel has a right to go and seek the release of the hostages. So we understand that, and our concern is the concern of many people over there, is for the civilians who are being killed in Gaza. We would like to see Israel avoid, such casualties. We have no problem if Israel wants to go after Hamas or after Islamic Jihad or after all these terrorists, but try to avoid harming the civilians. We also understand that it's very difficult to go to war in Gaza without harming civilians, because Gaza is a very small place. Hamas and Islamic Jihad are, first of all, they're not fighting in uniform. They're also fighting amongst the...
Just in regular clothes.
Yes, in regular clothes, number one. And number two, they're fighting from residential areas.
The death toll that's reported in Gaza is around 30,000 people. This is what we hear from the Hamas-run health ministry. Do you think that's accurate, that 30,000 civilians have been killed?
It's very hard to tell. I mean, this is the only source for this is the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health. Now, you don't have foreign journalists in Gaza. And I, as a journalist, I used to go to Gaza until 2007. I cannot go there anymore because Hamas seized control over Gaza. So there is no way of verifying these figures that we're hearing about.
In terms of the sentiment among Palestinians, you specialise in Palestinian affairs. Do the majority of Palestinians, you think, still support Hamas? Would they re-elect a Hamas government, or are they starting to think that, well, actually, this government that we elected has not taken us in a good direction and is responsible for the devastation and the loss of life that they're now experiencing?
Again, it's very hard to tell because we don't have elections over there. My feeling is that Hamas remains very popular among many Palestinians, and it's not necessarily because they love Hamas. It's mostly because when anyone attacks Israel, Palestinians switch their support to that party or to that leader. So Hamas is popular not because it's Hamas, because it attacked Israel, because it inflicted pain on Israel, because it caused Israel such damage. Now, I believe that if you hold free and democratic elections tomorrow morning, Hamas will still win. For the reason I just mentioned, and for another reason, it's because the Palestinian Authority is not seen as a better alternative to Hamas.
Well, the Palestinian Authority, the UN representative, just this week called Hamas their brothers. So they're at least, even though different factions, there's at least some support there.
Yeah, look, the Palestinian Authority is playing a double game. On the one hand, they are condemning Israel every day and they are attacking Israel. On the other hand, they are working with Israel through security coordination in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority was the victim of Hamas in 2007. I was in Gaza back then, and I saw Hamas wake up in the morning and kill dozens of them, if not hundreds, and seize control over Gaza. The Palestinian Authority despises Hamas, and they are praying that Israel will finish the job and get rid of Hamas, but they cannot say that openly.
Just very quickly before you go, do you think Hamas can truly be defeated if Israel doesn't go into Rafah?
No, it's like asking a racer in the marathon to stop before the finish line. Hamas has many forces in Rafah. And if you don't go there, you haven't destroyed Hamas's military capabilities. And they will be celebrating victory. So I don't see how you can really end this war or achieve victory without destroying Hamas's military capabilities. But then there's another problem. You might destroy Hamas's military capabilities. How do you destroy Hamas's ideology? That's another issue. And that can be done only if you have brave leadership that will embark on a process of de-radicalization of Palestinian society.
And the whole education system has to change, and the state-run television and everything. Khaled, very interesting to hear your perspective. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Now, Julian Assange's legal team claim that there are serious threats to his life from inside the CIA. They even say that they've seen and got evidence of a CIA plot to assassinate Assange. I mean, it sounds very far-fetched. I spoke with Julian Assange's high-profile lawyer, Jennifer Robinson. She's an Australian who's based in the UK, about his case and these stunning claims. I started by asking her about Julian Assange's reaction to the court decision to delay his appeal after his wife, Stella, said she was astounded by it.
I spent yesterday afternoon in prison with him after the judgment came down, going over the decision. And of course, it's disappointing. We are in a position where the court has, in fact, validated the concerns we've long had about this case, about the risk to free speech if he's extradited, about the risk he'd be exposed to the death penalty, about the discrimination he'll face as an Australian citizen in receiving constitutional protections. And yet the court yesterday decided, even though these are problems, we're going to offer the US the opportunity to remedy these fundamentally fatal flaws in their case by mere political promises. And this is unacceptable. This is an award-winning Australian citizen and journalist who is facing life in prison in the United States, and to extradite him on this basis, or potentially extradite him on this basis in the coming months, is unacceptable in our view.
If Assange is extradited to the US, are you concerned about the treatment he'd face under the justice system and even whether he could potentially face the death penalty?
The facts as set out on the Department of Justice indictment, as the US counsel in our extradition case acknowledged, could expose him to the death penalty, and the US has offered no assurance against that. So it is a risk, and it shouldn't be a risk. This is it's something that could be easily remediable by the US, and it's been 5 years of this extradition request being pursued by the US government, and no assurance has been forthcoming. We have been pointing this out for years, and yet here we are 5 years down the line. Julian Assange has been in a high security prison for 5 years without any charges, let alone without any conviction. And here we are 5 years later. And our position is we shouldn't even be talking about assurances because, as Amnesty International says, US assurances aren't worth the paper they're written on in any event. But what we should be talking about is the Department of Justice closing this case down. It is a case that threatens free speech everywhere. It threatens journalists and editors everywhere. If you publish truthful information about the United States, if you reveal human rights abuse and war crimes committed by the United States, then you could face life in prison without any constitutional free speech protections. That's a dangerous precedent.
But does Julian Assange accept, though, that his leaks may have endangered anyone or even could have cost lives?
There's no evidence, even on the US's own case, that anyone was physically harmed as a result of the WikiLeaks disclosures. There are a lot of statements by the government saying, well, this potentially caused harm, we needed to move people from particular embassies. But this ignores the immense public interest in these publications, revelations about war crimes, the killing of thousands more civilians in the Iraq War than was ever acknowledged. War crimes, corruption the world over. This material has been used in court cases around the world. Julian has won the highest journalistic award in Australia. He's won the Sydney Peace Prize. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize every year since. And when we're talking about journalism and publication and public interest, these things have to be weighed up. No one was physically harmed, and look what was revealed.
Isn't there a difference, though, that a journalist would have carefully gone through the information and selected what was in the public interest, but what wasn't going to potentially jeopardise lives, jeopardise sources, or require sources to be moved out of foreign countries? Isn't that what separates a journalist from just the dumping of information online like Julian Assange did?
I'm glad you asked that question, Sharri, because there's a huge misunderstanding about what actually happened with the WikiLeaks publications. There was not a dumping of the material online. WikiLeaks engaged in careful redaction processes with over 100 media partners around the world before the material was released online by another website in the United States because of a security breach, not by WikiLeaks, but by the Guardian newspaper. So the fact that this sort of argument that Julian just dumped material out into the public domain is simply incorrect. And I really urge you and your viewers to have a look at the evidence before the court and look into this issue, because WikiLeaks engaged in a very careful redaction process, and to the extent that the material was dumped out online, that was done by another website in the United States, not by WikiLeaks.
Is it accurate that a witness that you had wanted to give evidence in your court case has claimed that the CIA has plans to kidnap or even potentially assassinate Assange? Can you tell me about this?
This is an outrageous story, but one that is supported by more than a Yahoo News investigation, supported by more than 30 government sources, that the Trump administration had in fact planned to kidnap and kill Julian Assange in London. We have been trying to adduce this evidence in the extradition proceedings, showing that this shows the broader persecution of Julian Assange, that he's being targeted because of his political opinions, and about our concerns about what will happen to him once extradited to the United States. When you have a government that is planning to plot and kill a journalist, an Australian journalist, how can we have any faith in the way they're going to be treated within the legal system, particularly in a context where those same intelligence agencies who wanted to kill him have the power to put him under the kinds of oppressive prison conditions the medical evidence shows would cause his death? I know that sounds absurd, but this is precisely what's happening in Julian's case. He couldn't make it up.
Jennifer, what would be the motivation to kill Assange now? The information's already out there.
Sharri, I think you're missing the point. Whether or not what the intention is, we know from this story. What is their intention now? I can't imagine why the CIA would kill a journalist in any event, or plan to kill a journalist in any event. The fact is that the CIA
Do you think
did.
this is credible? You think this is credible information?
It is credible information. We have whistleblowers from inside the Ecuadorian embassy who spoke about how they talked about poisoning Julian, the security agency, the security company inside the embassy. That evidence is before the court. We've got a huge journalistic investigation supported by more than 30 internal sources from the CIA saying that this, from the government, saying that this was a plan to plot and kill an Australian journalist. And Mike Pompeo, when the information was released, said that those who released it should be prosecuted under the Espionage Act for having released the information. So I don't know how much more confirmation than you need. But as a fellow journalist, are you not concerned that there is sufficient information in the public domain to even reasonably conclude that the CIA had a plan to kill a journalist, and a fellow Australian journalist?
I think it's an extraordinary allegation, which is exactly why I raised it during this interview now. Just finally, Jennifer, the Albanese government has been raising Julian Assange's case with the US administration. Do you feel like the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, is doing enough?
Well, first, Sharri, I want to say I'm grateful to the Australian Prime Minister, the government and our Parliament and the Australian people for the huge amount of support that Julian's received in the recent times, and we know that the Prime Minister has raised this directly with President Biden. We want him to continue to do that. But what we want to say to the Australian government now is this is the time. The case is at the sharp end. We really are in a position where Julian could be extradited to the United States in a matter of months. If the US comes up with the assurances the court has requested, we've seen in this case that the court will waive through even unacceptable, in our view, assurances in order to be able to extradite him to the United States. So we face the very real prospect that he could be in the US in the coming months. That is unacceptable. That is a risk to his life. It's unacceptable for an Australian citizen to be in this position. And as the Australian Prime Minister has said, enough is enough. But what is the Australian government doing, and what pressure are they bringing to bear on the US to secure the outcome of Julian coming home to Australia? And that's a question for the Australian government. But we are insisting and asking the Australian government to do everything they can, because this is really we're coming to the end of the case.
Yeah. All right, Jennifer Robinson, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sharri. Great to speak with you.
And coming up after the break, the New South Wales Police Minister's shambolic attempt to clean up her reputational mess. Now she's let go of a fourth spin doctor, plus calls grow for the Prime Minister to visit Alice Springs after a curfew is imposed on the crime-ridden town. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, an update to our exclusive news tonight that former Home Affairs Secretary Mike Pezzullo is set to be stripped of his Order of Australia. I brought you already the comments supporting Pezzullo from former Prime Ministers Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison, who I spoke with today. But now we've got reaction from Victorian Liberal MP Georgie Crozier. She said this is extraordinary political interference by Labor, yet the likes of Brett Sutton get an AO, whilst Victorians have never got the truth about decisions made during COVID, including curfew. These decisions strip the rights of Victorians. Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Paterson says while Mike Pezzullo may not be perfect, he gave decades of professional service to our country and governments of both persuasion. He achieved many things in the national interest. Stripping his AO is incredibly petty. James Paterson says the Prime Minister should intervene to stop it. So James Paterson, Shadow Home Affairs Minister there, calling on Albanese to stop Mike Pezzullo from being stripped of his AO. Now, someone formerly involved in the awards tells me that it's extremely rare to strip someone of their AO, and it's normally reserved for criminals and pedophiles. Let's bring in now our panel tonight, our commentators Jason Morrison and Angela Mollard. Welcome to you both. Jason, just very quickly, your reaction to this story?
It's a stunning development. Those two MPs you've just quoted there, they're spot on. This is a revenge act because they've seen this guy's broken the code of the public service. Of course, it's a one-way code because everyone knows that the public service has been very left-leaning for a very long time, and suddenly there's a bloke that's flavoured one way against all expectations, and this is payback. And you look at this fella's citation, in 2020, It's an unbelievable CV that he has been awarded for, and for services at key aspects of the protection and heart and soul of why we really have government, defence and protection of the nation and interests. Has what he has done, which is probably foolish or ill-conceived, outweighed his enormous contribution? Absolutely not. It's a revenge act, and that's how it will be seen.
You'd think there'd be very few departmental secretaries who haven't engaged in political gossip like he did.
That's how you stay alive these days, unfortunately.
Well, it's just human nature to chat about various
Down there it is in Canberra. That's how you stay alive. Yeah.
All right, let's get on to other topics now. Now, the embattled New South Wales Police Commissioner Karen Webb, well, she's now officially on the hunt for her 5th spin doctor. This has become a shambles. She appointed Steve Jackson, a television producer and journalist, as her 4th spin doctor, an interim media advisor for 6 months. But the news just this afternoon that they've now revoked that job offer after a couple of weeks of scandals. Look, the media pylon was so massive that she probably had no choice but to cancel the appointment.
Absolutely, cancel the appointment. And of course, she did say that it was subject to, security vetting, that sort of thing. I'm just surprised why the police, who are investigators, didn't do their due diligence on this. Clearly, it was going to be problematic. It blew up really, really quickly. The relationship between police and journalists, and I think what's really sad about this is that when I first became a journalist, that relationship was really beneficial for both parties. Journalists got exclusives, police got, as long as they were giving information, they got left alone to get on with policing. And we've got this really awful situation now where nobody's winning from it. Look, Karen Webb needs to get in front of her messaging. The fact is that there was good policing around the recent double murder case of Jessie Baird. And
yes, actual police work was
really excellent police work, but the actual press conference afterward, it went on too long. The wrong people spoke. There was the wrong messaging around it. She, of course, said that she was grateful. This was in a couple of days earlier. Grateful that the accused and the person who's alleged to have murdered, that they were grateful that had given up the bodies. Just really poor. I think they need I actually don't think they need a journalist. I think they need a damage limitation expert. I think they need to start looking overseas. 300K though, that's a big salary. You could buy 3 police officers for that.
Jason, they probably don't need a new media advisor. No media advisor can fix Karen Webb. No, they need a new police commissioner.
They need a better judgment at the top. And this is the chaos and the sham that it all is because of ill judgment. And she has admitted, and she did so on Ray Hadley's program 2GB the other day, she doesn't really know the scene, so she relied on people in the political group to give her advice, and their advice was, an old mate. And I kind of got to declare, I know absolutely everybody in this story. Yeah, I know them well. I've worked with half a dozen of them, including people we're not even talking about tonight.
Most people in the media industry reporting on this know everyone involved.
So take the characters out for a second. Yeah. There should not be ever, and there has been in the past as well, people who there've been issues with, and it shouldn't be like that. And you're quite right, Angela. I mean, when you've got a problem and there's a big cloud in front, you've got to look past it. And they have not done that, and the judgment is her problem. Her media performance is a secondary issue.
Angela, let's turn to Alice Springs. Major news this week, very radical reforms, the nighttime curfew from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. for teenagers. Now there's discussion that it should apply to adults. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you can't lock down whole communities indefinitely, can you? But I do see that this is a short-term solution. It's for 2 weeks. The Northern Territory state, the Territory is saying, look, it might have to go longer than that. We have a national youth crime issue. It's terrible in Queensland as well. This week I interviewed Lee Lovell, the widow of Emma Lovell, who of course she was murdered on Boxing Day 2022 in front of her 2 daughters. He was stabbed. There was a halfway house around the corner. One of those perpetrators has pleaded guilty. The other one still has to plead guilty. The most he can get in prison, this youth, which we don't have a name for because he's underage, is 10 years. This is not the case in the UK. 2 youths in the UK just got put away for 20 and 22 years, respectively, for killing a trans teenager. Now, I covered the Jamie Bolger case when I first moved to Britain many years ago. Really, young children or teenagers killing other other young kids. You have to lock people up, and then you have to sort out the problem in places like Alice Springs. But I don't know how we sort it out. We go around in circles in this, and we step back from it because there's Indigenous issues. Sometimes I think, okay, if it was a whole white community, would we be dealing with it differently?
We would. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows we're treading carefully at the moment because it's too difficult and it's very inconvenient to understand the heart and soul of this problem. And it's not just the kids, going beyond that. Why are the kids out on the street at night? Because their bloody homes are so horrific to be in, and they're actually safer from their own perspective out on the street. So, this is a vicious cycle, and the judiciary does us no benefit because it actually doesn't want to address the core thing. The police force is hamstrung. It's led, as we've just been discussing, in a different corner of the country, but no different. Weak leaderships riddled throughout the whole system. Toughness will get us past this, and legitimately dealing with problems rather than dancing around them will actually go a long way.
Yeah. All right, let's have a look at the bridge in Baltimore that we've been covering on the program this week. Divers have recovered another 2 bodies submerged in a ute in the Patapsco River. You'd think I'd be able to say that perfectly by now after a week of it. Angela, this is terribly sad story, of course, for those families involved. It is so lucky that there weren't more lives lost. Yeah,
because they got that warning, and of course there weren't more people on that bridge. And some of the analysis I've been reading today is that why is there not the structures around those pylons that, engineering wise, and the number of accidents I was reading throughout the world. There's hundreds of accidents with ships and a bridge. Why were there not there's a lot of money saving going on, basically. Money saving with the ship that hit it, the money saving around the bridge. It begs the question, doesn't it? The first thing I thought was, could this happen in Sydney? And that's what I want to know. Could that happen here?
Well, let's hope not. We're out of time, though. Jason Morrison, Angela Muller, thank you both so much.
Thanks, Sharri.
Now, after the break, the hypocrisy of the UN. A former United Nations Assistant Secretary General will join me live. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, let's bring in now Professor and former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, Ramesh Thakur. Ramesh, thank you very much for joining me this evening. Look, on Monday, the UN Security Council passed an immediate ceasefire vote, which Israel's supposed closest ally, the US, abstained from. This obviously angered Israel. What was your view on how this vote went down?
Well, I think it reflects a lot of anger in the UN community on the civilian carnage that's inevitable when you have a war. I think they forget a couple of key things, though. One, the war started with the Hamas attacks on October 7 that were particularly brutal and gruesome. And were it not for what happened on 7th October, there would be no Israeli military presence in Gaza today. The second thing they forget is that the war could indeed end if Hamas released all the hostages, surrendered its weapons, and handed over for trial the senior commanders responsible for what happened on 7th October. And the third thing is, I think they ignore the reality that the civilian casualties are so high because Hamas has embedded its fighters in densely populated civilian residential neighborhoods, in schools, under hospitals, and even has built a command center, a communication center under the offices of UNRWA, the chief UN agency in the region. So I think it was one-sided in its impact, which is why Hamas welcomed it, and Israel says we're not going to respond to it.
All absolutely excellent points, Ramesh. Is the United Nations now unrecognisable to you?
No, I think we all want the United Nations to be effective against every other country, but react with anger when it turns its attention to us. The Security Council is a geopolitical cockpit of the UN system. It's not a world court. It's not an ethics body where they debate things on merits. It reflects different perspectives, and there's a change afoot. Israel is losing support in Western countries. We see that on our own streets. It's losing support internationally. And part of the Hamas calculations would have been to provoke a severe Israeli retaliation that mobilize the Arab street, inflame Muslim and Arab opinion, and bring protesters onto the streets of Western capitals. I mean, they've done every trick so far.
They have indeed. Indeed.
Israel is being
Ramesh,
delegitimized.
I apologise.
Yeah.
We're out of time. I apologise, but thank you very much for your insights. And that's all we've got time for tonight. Thank you so much for your company. Happy Easter. Have a lovely and safe weekend, especially on the roads. I'll be here Easter Monday. I'll see you at 8 p.m. And right now, here's Paul Murray.